It's Bourbon Night. It's semi-live, sort of
Kind
live.
of live. Not really.
Not really,
It's pre-recorded.
but welcome in. If you're watching this semi-live, we are traveling. We'd be coming back from Austin, right?
And I think we're still in Austin.
We're still in Austin.
Having a
So
great time.
I think we're having a great time right now. I'm sure we are. But we wanted to do this pre-recorded live.
Since we can't do a regular live with you guys.
Exactly. And we do have some questions from our Patreon community, so we'll be getting...
yes, excited to get those answered.
Yeah. But let's go ahead and bring in our guest for the evening.
Yeah, what are we drinking, Chad?
Well, we're going to be drinking on some Barrell. We got some Barrell 33, and we have the new Barrell Vantage.
Ooh, I can't wait to get to that one. I'm very excited.
And who best to take us through a tasting of these? But Will Schragis, he is the Chief Product Innovation Officer
over at
Barrell Craft Spirits. And please welcome back to the show, Will. Hey, Will.
Thanks for having me. It's been more than a year, right?
It has.
It has. I can't believe that. It feels like we just had you on not that long ago.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it. It's like I try to judge how long it's been between I talk to people based on like what items we tasted last time, and then I place it. And I couldn't remember what we tasted last time. And I was like, okay, then it has to have been at more than a year if I don't remember.
If you can't remember it.
I think we talked about seagrass last time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it was probably like right as we were kind of like doing the hard launch. We did soft launch on seagrass. Makes a lot of sense. Anyway, it's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
we're happy to have you.
Thanks for being on. Let's just go ahead and, we don't want to sit here with empty glasses for too long. Let's go ahead and get some of this batch 33 poured up.
Yeah.
33
batches is a lot of batches.
Yeah, it's wild.
Have you been there since batch 1?
No. So I have known Joe, the owner and founder of Barrell, since batch 1, but I bought batch 1 when I was working in a retail store and auction house in New York, and that's where I met him. I was the second buyer to say yes to Barrell Bourbon batch 1 in the country. And we just sort of stayed in touch. And I started doing some consulting work for him around batch 4 and 5. And I believe batch 7 was the first batch that I was a full-time employee when it was released, maybe 6, I can't remember. So no, not quite all 33, though I have been around them. I would say about 28 of the 33 I've been on. And secretly there's actually 35 because there was batch 7B and batch 8B, which were, we at the time didn't control our own bottling facility completely. And we had to wait a couple months between bottling, and the whiskey changed to the point where we didn't feel comfortable calling it the same thing. So it's the same whiskey with 4 or 5 months more age on it. And so there's these two sort of very, very small secret batches, batch 7B and batch 8B.
I did not know that.
How collectible.
Yeah.
But that's really cool, though, that you bought batch 1 and like have been familiar with the company since the beginning. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's really nice.
All the batches?
Do I?
Yeah.
I have one bottle of every batch. My bottle of batch 2, even though it has not been opened, half of the strip seal tore. So I do not have an undamaged bottle of batch 2. I have one single bottle of batch 1 through 4, I think.
Sweet.
And
wish I could say the same.
Like, someone get this man a perfect bottle of batch 2.
Yeah, really. Someone give me a bottle of batch 1.
People, I think, assume that companies like ours have these huge backstocks for them. So we get asked all the time. And I think Joe is down to like 5 or 6 bottles of a lot of the batches. And so we talk a lot about how we want to do a retrospective or a vertical tasting with everything at some point. But it really has to be an event and a collection of people that we want to do it for, because we really can only do it maybe 2 or 3 more times ever.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Well, remember us when you're sending out those invites.
Stop it. Oh my gosh.
Come on, Sarah. You gotta ask. Let's talk about the bona fides real quick on batch 33. So this is 116.6 proof, and it's 5 years in age. And it looks like we're coming from Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee.
So it's 5 years in age, but I believe with almost every batch we put out now, there is as old as about 16-year-old in it.
Yeah.
There's usually a critical mass between around 7 and 10. We have more and more batches that are coming out with the 5 and 6-year-old age statement, and it's not for trying to stretch whiskey further. It's because we have distillate that we've watched it grow up, and we really like where it is right now. And we like using that for the sort of freshness and proof and all the reasons that you would. It's why if you look at the sort of winners of ours over the years, almost all of them are lower age statement batches, but they're not bourbons that taste younger. They're just bourbons that have larger spans of ingredients in the blend. Similarly, we have a lot of component ingredients that we use that are already vats that we know a lot about. We know how it plays with other whiskey really well. They're sort of pieces of blends that we have developed over long periods of time to really understand, and we keep them in stainless steel, not in oak, so that they don't over oak in any way. And they have a variety of age in them. And so it's interesting, as we're always sort of writing the details on it for our website and such, it has gotten more and more difficult to describe in the vocabulary that the whiskey world at large uses what is happening with our blends, because they're made up of things that have been blended over time at this point.
That's really cool.
I've kind of noticed, I don't know if it's a trend or if it's just becoming popular right now. I guess that is what a trend is, isn't it? But I've seen some labels, some labels out there that will have, this is a 5 and a 15-year-old. And it's like, well, it doesn't technically work that way. I mean, it does.
They put that on the label.
They put it on the label, as an age statement.
I mean, technically, it's listing the youngest stuff.
It is, yeah. But
I don't know how they.
I don't know, like, just anecdotally, how you feel about that, or is that anything that Barrell would ever be like? Well, there are people doing this. Maybe we should put 5 and 16 or whatever.
My understanding of the rulings on label law right now, and I think that it's really important that everyone in the whiskey world knows that gray area is not the right term, but the guidelines by which you design labels in America or other countries are not hard, fast rules with obvious definitions. There's certain things that are very obvious. The alcohol percentage has to be right. You know, if it is not vodka, you can't call it vodka, things like that. But, did I just lose you?
No, we're here.
Nope. We just put you.
You're just big.
You are front and center.
Sorry about that.
You're okay.
The rules are written, and there's a lot of whiskey and other alcoholic products, for lack of a better term, that more than one category could apply to, or the guidelines don't exactly detail what to do in every scenario. And most companies do their best. There's some companies that are very deliberate about trying to mislead people, and shame on them. But there are a lot of companies, especially a lot of small companies, that do their best, and then the TTB reviews it, and if they approve it, it becomes the label. And if they don't approve it, you change that. And so my understanding of age statement is you have to designate what the youngest whiskey is. And if you would like to designate the recipe, so long as you are clear about the ratios, you're not misleading, you are allowed to. So there are whiskeys that say 30% X, 20% X, 50% X. If you look at our private release bourbon line, we do that on those. So it'll say 4 age statements, and it'll tell you the percentage by volume of each. I do not believe it has been ruled as okay to just say 5 and 15. I think that if you are going to say 5 and 15, you are supposed to give some indication as to, is it 5 with a drop of 15? Is it half and half?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. Are we talking like 95% 5, 5% 15? Yeah.
That being said, like, all of that is individual interpretation on the person who's submitting the guideline and the person who's reviewing the label as to does it. The analogous example that I give all the time is that bourbon has to be made out of at least 51% corn. It doesn't say how you define 51% corn. Is it by volume? Is it by weight? If it's by volume and you mill the corn versus not milling the corn, you suddenly have very different amounts of corn. So is it by volume adjusted for the milling size of each grain? And then if you take corn from a very hot year and corn from a very cold year, they have different amounts of active fermentables. And so the impact on what is actually going to wind up in the whiskey is very different. And so if you adjust for all of that, you could, in theory, have a bourbon that is both legal and illegal at the same time. Or is legally bourbon and legally not bourbon at the same time.
This never occurred to me, but it makes so much sense what you're saying. Like, is everyone working with the same rule book, and even though they're not doing anything intentionally to like break rules, like you said, who's to determine, is it by weight or by volume? And if it's, you know, by one of those things, like what's the standard kind of threshold?
I'm not pointing my finger in a bad way at anyone. I think it just is it's a wonderfully playful example of this weird duality we have in America at large, where we have a culture of this is right, this is wrong, this is illegal, this is illegal. And then we have a legal system of interpretation where we write things and then someone else has to decide what it means.
Yeah.
And it manifests itself beautifully in labeling law, where there's guidelines, and ultimately I don't judge people by is it okay or is it not okay. I judge people by, did you do your best to tell the consumer what they were having? For us, with something like batch 33, it would be misleading for us to try to put 1 or 2 or 3 sentences about what the blend for batch 33 is on the front label, because there are components in it that have, the component might actually technically have as old as 19-year-old bourbon in it, but it was 16 when we took it out of the barrel 3 years ago and we started building the vat that became the component. So there's no 19-year-old bourbon in there because it was, you know, stopped aging at some point. And also the 16-year-old was one ingredient 3 years ago and it's been drawn down. So there's anywhere between a drop and a barrel of 16-year-old in that one component that went into something before. And so what we have sort of ruled internally with the batches, because we have so many different programs now, where the batches of bourbon is the simplest and most obvious guideline that we can sort of live by, is your age statement is the youngest bourbon in the barrel, in the bottle. And that is an easy way to always have it be something that we know we're not being misleading. With something like the private release bourbon series, that those are made up usually of 4 components that each have an age statement. And so we can easily do a volumetric ratio and put it on the label. Something like a batch, it's a much more complicated blend. And so we feel the spirit of the law is you put the youngest thing on it.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Well, I'm really liking batch 33. I think one of our Patreon questions was sort of in the realm of this, but what batches specifically have sort of, from a fan standpoint, have jumped out and had more popularity than others and sort of became like infamous? Is there certain ones that you can remember that have just had a cult following behind it?
The one that has become most infamous by far is batch 11. Which 11 was the one that won. I love that you guys don't know that off the top of your head, because it means we have done a good job.
Yeah.
Really good.
Now that you say 11, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that. But it wasn't on top of mind.
I also feel like there was one in like the early 20s, like 22 or 23, that a lot of people talked about. But yeah, no one sticks out as like, oh, that one batch was the one.
So what happened was batch 7 was I believe 6-year-old. It was the first time we ever blended old bourbon and young bourbon with big age differences together and declassified it down. And we got a lot of eye rolling about we're running out of aged bourbon. And then it was a finalist for best small batch bourbon in San Francisco, I think, that year. So it didn't win, but it got on the board. And people started noticing, like, okay, batch 7 is really good. But then as a sort of middle finger to the naysayers, Joe released batch 8, which we called the Big Oak Unicorn, which was 132 proof, 8-year-old.
Whoa.
And it was a way of being like, no, this was a component in other things, but you want us to prove that we still got it. We still got it. It was a very small batch. And we allocated batch 8 differently than we had allocated other things. We gave it to states that didn't push back on 7, because 7 was awesome. Batch 9 was a 13-year-old. It was the oldest age statement we ever put out. And batch 10 was, I want to say, an 8-year-old again, but it was a higher age statement than the blend of different. But we had actually been working on batch 11 since batch 7. Batch 11 was the first of a type of blend that we make that we call likeness blends, where there's many, many ingredients and the barrels are picked for 1 or 2 very specific features that they have that are in danger of getting blended out. So like a very fleeting flavor profile that if if everything doesn't have that flavor profile, it's going to lose itself in the blend. So batch 11 was extremely light, almost lemony style of bourbon. Is a very citrus forward, very low oak impact blend of many different mash bills, many different ages. And it won, I think, best bourbon in San Francisco that year. It won the big crowd, the big award. And that was the batch, I think, that put us on the map as blending is an art, and these people do it as well as anyone in the country. And so it wasn't the first time we got a call out like that in San Francisco, but it was the first time we got the big award, and we got it on a bourbon that was not oaky and was not a high age statement, and was sort of not what people thought they were looking for. And because of that, it disappeared immediately, but also we get asked for that all the time, because I think it was this moment that we didn't have the stock to give it to every state yet. We didn't have the stock where someone could order, an account could order as much as they wanted, or a store could order as much as they wanted. And so it was the moment that it became it went into the raffles with the Pappies kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
11 sort of had some more to it in that. Beyond that, and I'll try to limit this because there's so many of them that are have a cool little story about it. Batch 16 did not win any major awards and was not hard to find, more so than other batches, but it was the company favorite between 11 and 20 of that decade. 11 is obviously the one that we all sort of remember well, but of that whole set, 16 was the one that people everyone in the company thought was going to be the one that became sought after. It turned out that 18 won a bunch of awards, but 16 was the one that we really loved. 22.
I'm like, do we have this?
I know we don't have 11 and we don't have 16. I think
we might have 18.
I think 20. Yeah, maybe. I think the teens is about when we started getting into it. Because I'm sure you guys experienced this with the bourbon boom and so many new labels, coming online. As a bourbon collector, especially one who's sort of been in it longer and kind of become aligned with some of the, the Kentucky Bourbon Trail distilleries, like the bigger guys. It's kind of hard to make room in your life for new labels, right? If you dip a toe in a lot of the major distilleries, and then with all the numerous ones that come about, I'm sure there's kind of a period of people need to feel it out.
If you're someone who cares about the micro variations with easily findable, so if you're someone who likes get different barrels of Elijah Craig single barrel,
yeah,
once you get good at finding that, you can kind of get a lot of Elijah Craig single barrel, and so you can put together 50, 60 bottles a year of it if you really want to. And I hope there aren't that many people that are drinking 50 or 60 bottles of Elijah single barrel every year. Same thing with all the Roses recipes and the picks from them. And I think increasingly with Old Forester and Jack Daniel's picks and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that there are people who have one of every batch from us are fewer and further between than they were at one point, I think, partially because we do solidly 4 or 5 batches a year now. And because the industry of special releases has caught up a little bit, and because our focus as a company has moved away from being just bourbon. And so there's a lot of people that are seagrass drinkers and dovetail drinkers, or private release whiskey drinkers. And so, excuse me. And so there definitely are still people who buy every batch, and there's people who are very much bourbon from us, but bourbon is not the only thing we do anymore. And so because of that, we see a little bit more of learning about the different batches and deciding which one to get that season sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, I can kind of see as a new company, I'm sure you guys experienced the same growing pains that all new companies have. You kind of, a consumer a lot of times will need to have that experience where their friend gets a bottle and then word of mouth and oh no, it's legit. Okay. Yeah. I've seen it in the store, but I'm just so used to grabbing this bottle from this distillery and this bottle from this distillery. And I think with us anyway, us not getting our first bottle till it was the teens around there, is because, well, it's different for us since we're a channel. We kind of have to we have our bourbon budget and we have to spend wisely. So, to make videos about things.
Or in the early days.
In the early days, yeah, when we were making zero
Yeah.
off the channel. So I'm sure you guys kind of felt that way growing early on. And I'm sure that batch 11.
I was going to say, I think that's where
sent up the flag
the
for a lot of people.
Probably, that awards buzz, and that buzz around like 7, 8, 9, like you were saying, really put the word out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's interesting looking back on it and being part of the production and the like where to put your money and your effort side of it too, and how that only shows years later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so right now, for instance, with the next whiskey we're going to try, Vantage, that has 3 different virgin secondary maturations on it, and with gold label bourbon that came out last year that had 2 years of toasted oak on about 25% of it. That is not decisions that we made right now. That's 2 years ago when we invested in a wood program. And we are going to be very specific about the barrels we're sourcing, even though we're entering all sorts of different things into them and we're going to use them for different things. And that only became something that we knew we had to focus on because of Dovetail and the private release whiskey program from years before, where we started doing all these crazy finishes, all these crazy secondary maturations. And it became a little bit something that we knew we could do at a level that other people couldn't do because of the experiential diversity within our blending team, and also because we control all of our own space and we have so many different types of whiskey to work with. And thinking back on batches 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, for instance, which were so different from each other, that actually was in response to batches 2 and 3 and 4 being successful and well received, and there being more suppliers, more distilleries that wanted to work with Joe early on than when he first started, and having different types of bourbon within the same sort of blending spice cabinet to work with. So it's interesting thinking about those eras, not so much as what was coming out, but what were we doing to prepare for the future a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I have a question, and I want to, before we move on to the Vantage, because I want to move on to that too, but I want to talk about this. But before we talk about that, I'm kind of interested in what you just said. I'm wondering, and if this is a good question, I'm not sure, but did your decisions to do those finishes, as you said, like you have the opportunity to do these different experiments and finishes, was that determined by what was made available to you at the time and is still made available to you as far as what you're able to put into the blends, or is what you do, the blends and the experiments that you do, is it determined by what you have access to? So I guess does that make sense? Okay.
At this point in our company, and for years now, the two are somewhat unrelated to each other. There's the sourcing side, and it is about getting our hands on as much high quality distillate as possible at various ages, aged in different places, different toast levels, different warehouses, as much variation as we can possibly have. And when we buy something that is homogeneous and it's a lot of barrels, we do our best to get it as different as possible, as quickly as possible. So we dump some and put them in stainless steel. We move some to hot warehouses. We put some in cold warehouses. We keep some palletized. We lay some on their sides. We transfer some into secondary maturation. And even within that, let's say there's 100 barrels and they're all going to the same warehouse. We may plan on using some of them that year and plan on using some of them the year after and plan on using some of them 3 years from now. And so we've created differentiation over 3 years because they will be different ages by the end of it. And that allows us to have as many different things to call on from a research and development standpoint, and also from a knowing what we need and already owning it. We work very hard not to rely on anything in any of the projects we're working on that we don't already have control of and know how it's going to function. And that allows us to be really deliberate with our blends, because it's not like, what does it need? What does it need? Try the different spices. It's like, this is a thing that we know how it works, and we're going to lab test it, and we're going to see if it works. And we know how much we have, and we know we can hit the volume that we need to hit for the plan of that item in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And that's a luxury that we have now that we did not always have, in terms of like we can't create an item without a reasonable idea of what we want it to do functionally for the portfolio and the business. And it doesn't mean we don't make things in really small quantities. We just have to know what we're getting ourselves into.
Mm-hmm.
If we produce a blend, if we produced seagrass and there was no plan to be able to make more seagrass,
you'd have a problem because a lot of people want it.
And what happened is seagrass got really popular really fast, and it was really hard to find for about a year. But now, if a person's trying to buy seagrass and the store tries to bring it in for that person and the store can't get it, we've got a big problem with our distributor, because that distributor can get it from us. The goal of seagrass is not to be a hunter's whiskey. It's to be a whiskey that anyone can find anywhere that is selling, $80 to $100 bottles of whiskey. Mm-hmm. There are other items we make, like the gold label bourbon, which is $500 a bottle, that we are so concerned with executing on a level there that it doesn't matter if we can only make 100 or 200 or 1,000 bottles that year, because it's about delivering on the $500 promise. And we know we'll deal with only 200 bottles in the market if we have to deal with that. So each project has its own sort of constraints from a business side on, is it worth doing at all? Is it going to cause more problems than it solves?
That makes sense.
Well, kind of talking about batch 33 here. Do you have some poured there? You drinking along with us, or are we? Okay, good. Yeah. I want to get, your inside opinion on 33, versus like the last 10 or 12. Like, where do you think this falls as far as your personal favorites or the profile that you lean towards? Like, what are you tasting in this glass?
First of all, I want to preface that with, I try to be really careful about talking about my favorites as if it means it's going to be someone else's favorite.
Because it's also
we do it all the time, so it's fine.
I mean, also, I'm a little bit of an atypical bourbon drinker, because when you're around really cool whiskey all the time, but also its work, you're more impressed by things that surprise you than you are with just good whiskey. Mm-hmm. And so I think about the batches that I really like, and it's because they had things in them that I was deeply impressed with our blending team to be able to tease out of barrels in one way or another. Okay. And so, like, what I really love about 33 is actually there's this like very honeyed nose to it. Mm-hmm. And when I think about bourbon specifically, the canon of bourbon that is following the rules and also not doing something weird, every bourbon is spicy in some way or another. Every bourbon is sweet in some way or another. Every bourbon has some type of fruit in some way or another. There's flavor notes that we extrapolate, but they all actually fall into the same 4 or 5 categories for bourbon. If you were to ask me and I were to ask you to close your eyes and write tasting notes for pretty much any bourbon in America, you could probably get away with it, even though they wouldn't be helpful notes, but you could say vanilla, baking spice, burnt oil, whatever. And if someone was reading it and smelling the bourbon, they would probably smell that. Yeah. And so when there's something that is striking about a bourbon, that is what is impressive to me. And so I really like 33, like totally honestly, as our batches go, 33 is probably my favorite in the 30s so far. And what I like about it is when the sweetness flavor is so distinctly honey or maple or brown sugar or something. It has such an olfactory for me. To me, that is peculiar. That's like out of the ordinary for a blend of bourbon or a release of bourbon. And so I'm more impressed by that than I am with like, okay, it has a sweet nose. But I know that is very subjective to my own way of smelling it. Mm-hmm.
I've just been sitting here smelling it we've been talking for, 20, 30 minutes, and I've just been sitting here nosing it the whole time because it reminds me of like a hot tea, like a honey floral, slightly spiced, slightly citrus, just comfy mug of tea in like a really, really great way. Mm-hmm. And I like it, like what makes bourbons my favorite, or when it reminds me of something very specific that I can hold on to like that, like the experience of drinking a cup of tea or being in a place. Right. That's like, for me, what makes things stick out as my favorites. So It's cool to hear you talk about that for you.
Is anyone else getting a little peachy note? Or is that just me? Sometimes it's just me.
I mean, it's not wrong.
I mean, no. That's just you, Chad.
I think also there's this really nice play that you get in bourbon where the like almond marzipan to stone fruit profile,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of it either stays in the nut side or it moves to the fruit side, kind of like Almoretto, like made out of almonds, but actually Di Serono is not made out of almonds; it's made out of like peach pits or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And because that though that almond as a nut is actually a seed of a plant that is much more closely related to other stone fruit, and so you get like that weird spectrum. And I agree that this is much more on the fruit side of that spectrum than it is on the like nutty side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a disservice to tasting notes or talking about whiskey when you put this sort of oxidative peanutty in the same conversation, because that's like a different aspect of whiskey, even though it's both nuts. That to me, almond is more a lack of the fruit with the same congener than it is in comparison to like a peanut.
Yeah, I've never thought about it that way.
That is interesting. Yeah, our nutty meter is usually never off. This wasn't setting off the nutty meter, but
I can. It's like I can almost see where if it moved bit, one way that it would be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
It's like I can see the part of it.
Just because I know that people who subscribe to the channel love this. The sleeper to me from the past, at this point, it's more than a year, is still batch 27.
Okay.
On the radar, it was my favorite thing we did. I guess it was last year. Favorite bourbon we did.
Wow.
And I'm not exactly sure why I think part of it had to do with the time of year it was released, and part of it had to do with 28 winning a bunch of awards. So people just kind of moved to that. And 28 also being a bigger bourbon. It's like oakier, higher age statement. But 27 to me, it was one of the batches that had some wheated bourbon in it. It was just like really lean and fruit forward and wonderful. And when I see that's when like when I see it on a bar or something, like I will decide on our bourbon versus Dovetail or Seagrass or something when it's 27. Every time I go back to it, I really
You're
love
going
it.
for it.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay.
I'm gonna keep that in mind. I think you're right. I think we do have a bottle around here somewhere.
I think we might, yeah. Sarah, do you want to ask another Patreon question while we sort of before we switch over to Vantage?
I mean, I think we've covered a bit of I know one of the questions was from batch 1 to batch 33, kind of has your approach changed or the vision changed? But I think we talked a bit earlier on about that.
I think the big change in the approach and also the vision is we have so much more at our disposal now. We have a bigger team. We have more stock. We have a more engaged fan base, for lack of a better term, and it allows us to be more ourselves and not have to worry about how things are going to be received if we love them. It allows us to take longer on projects before they reach the market because we know that we have a pipeline of things that are coming. It allows us to hire differently. It allows us to talk about whiskeys in a more cerebral, more detail-oriented way. And I really think if you look at batch, 25 or so and onward, you can see the success of the company 2 years before that in the complexity of those batches, because you see that is when there was really the amount of investment in like, this is going to continue to grow and this is going to be really successful. And so what is so cool for me now, because I spent a week a month in New York where I am now and a week a month in Kentucky, and then 2 weeks on the road traveling around other markets. And so going back to Kentucky every month and seeing the stuff that is being worked on, knowing that there's 1 month, 6 months, a year to polish it, I just think there's so much more complexity in everything we're doing. That whereas I think a lot of companies become a national brand in one way or another and rest on their laurels, our shtick, the reason that we have been able to enjoy success and growth is because we've been on the forefront and the cutting edge of blending and flavor matching and listening to people in the whiskey industry and trying to develop things that we know will be relevant for right now, which is how Vantage we're about to taste was named. It's like named after our perspective on the whiskey industry. And so we know we have to keep doing that. I've started visualizing it as like we are surfing on the front of whiskey in America. We're still in the water. We're not Cliff, right? Like we're solidly in the water of whiskey, but we need to stay that like step ahead of it, or else the whiskey industry is going to eat us up into just another brand. And what being successful with Dovetail and Seagrass and having them be received well, people like liking the whiskeys and having our perspective be thought of as like part of the whiskey industry in America, it's allowed us to start doing some tricks. It's like we can now feel comfortable in what we do and take more chances. And by chances, I don't mean make things that are crazier. I mean invest more deeply in ideas. And so the amount of work it took to get the amount of whiskey into the secondary maturation casks to have Vantage be a big enough release that everyone who wants to buy a bottle of Vantage this year is going to get to buy a bottle of Vantage this year was 2 years worth of work and investment for what seems like just one item for us. But it was actually so much more than a set of single barrels or a set of private releases or a batch of bourbon, because it was like, this needs to be the same in perpetuity and be big. And it's going to take 2 years to get there. Sorry, I get it.
No, that's really cool. It sounds like that mindset of kind of trying to stay out ahead of the industry as a whole has been what kind of has pushed you all to innovate, to get things like Dovetail, like Seagrass, and like this one that we're about to drink that people have really fallen in love with. I think that's really neat. I love, when that type of motivation inspires that kind of innovation.
Yeah, and kind of what I've gathered, one from our conversations in the past and this one, and then also just sort of tracking the progress of Barrell Craft Spirits over the years, is you guys don't ever try to like play the hits, this batch really blew up for us and did well, let's just try to do that. It's like if you've ever seen the movie Chef, it's like you're not just making the chocolate lava cake all the time because it's what it's so popular. You're like that chef who wants to push the boundaries and keep innovating and not resting on your laurels, because that's kind of what causes
it gets a little stagnant. I don't know.
Yeah, stagnation.
And then when you have so much competition, it's easy to get a little lost, I think, or also be more tempted to play the hits and be like, well, let's try to create another batch 11 or another batch 18 or whatever it is. So kudos on that. Yeah.
And Vantage.
It smells so good.
Give you the bona fides here. This is a blend of straight bourbon whiskeys finished in Mizunara, French, and toasted American oak.
It must be the French and toasted American oak, because
it's 114.44 proof. Nice. And again, our states of origin are the same. It's Indiana, Tennessee, and Kentucky.
I love the nose on this. It's so... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's so desserty and warm. It's lovely.
This falls into the same structure, if you will, as Dovetail, Armida, Seagrass, where it's 3 different components blended separately, matured for a second time separately, but with the intent of being a component, not with the intent of being a full-fledged whiskey, and then a blend of those 3. The difference here is, unlike Dovetail, Armida, Seagrass, all of the secondary maturation is virgin oak. And so this actually qualifies for everything that would legally make it a bourbon in America. It falls into the blend of straight bourbons because of the different states. And it's a lot of oak on it, because when you do virgin oak secondary maturation, it's a whole nother barrel of unused hemicellulose. One of the challenges in toasted oak finish and French oak finish, and to some extent Mizunara finish, although there's not a lot of whiskey to taste to gain wisdom on Mizunara, and so a lot of it was like a work in progress for us. But one of the challenges is finding the sweet spot where it is not bitter, because it hasn't been, the new barrel is going to give like new oak bitterness. But it also hasn't pulled so much oak that you have 2 barrels worth of oak on 1 barrel worth of whiskey that is offsetting or off-putting. And so I am still figuring out how I want to talk about Vantage in interviews like this, because this reached the market 2-3 weeks ago. And every time I go back to it, there's so much going on in it because it's interesting bourbons to start, and then it is whole barrels worth of other flavor in 3 different ways, and then blended together again. But I think that the real challenge with the production of it is finding a way to not have it be over oaked and not taste young at the same time, because that when to pull out of the second barrel is so time sensitive.
Yeah, that's what we've gathered.
And what I think that they did an amazing job in the production side of it is so sweet on the nose, and there is clearly a lot of oak organic matter in the whiskey, and there's frankly a lot of like whiskey sweetness in it, but there is still a good amount of tannin, and so it ends dry. It is not a clawingly sweet whiskey in any way. It's just like it has all the flavor of a bourbon that should be too sweet, but it finishes dry anyway.
Yeah, but not too dry, because a dry finish is a little bit of a killer for me, and I don't find this to be too dry at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does kind of do that. It pulls back on
I
the
like
sweetness.
that. Yeah. It's like from the nose, I expect it to be, a certain level of like desserty sweet, but I think that oak really pulls that back, even though it's still, there is a sweetness there. It's not overly sweet.
Will, is there any...
It's delicious.
I know this one doesn't have any type of age statements on it, but is there any type of like range that you can kind of give us?
Like the batches, the youngest thing in here is about 5 years old, and the oldest is as old as 16.
Okay.
And the 3 different ingredients are blended very much for flavor consistency. And so those vattings before the secondary maturation, we need, because the virgin oak, the toasted American oak, the virgin French, virgin Japanese, they're going to do their thing to the whiskey, and it's going to go, every barrel is going to go different ways. We really have to start with the same thing in all of those. Not in each ones, but within one category, we have to start with the same thing if we're going to have any chance of getting the same thing out of it. And so the vattings that go into it are very strictly monitored by Trip and Nick and Joe of like, we need to make sure that this is not only tasting the same, but of a very similar proof each time we start this process over again, because we need to make sure we have a critical mass at the end that can be blended into a consistent flavor profile. And if you think about the sort of evolution of our company, only with Stellum did we start having to blend to proof, because Stellum still cask strength, but it's a consistent proof. And so that was a lesson that was learned right around when the production of Vantage, of what became Vantage, started. Of like, we need whiskey that's at the same proof to go into the secondary maturation, because the same thing at different proofs is going to pull very different things out of a virgin oak barrel with 2 years or 1 year, whatever. So 5 to 16 is the short answer, but it's not a good answer, if that makes sense.
But it's an answer. We'll take it. What about MSRP on this guy?
So it's the same as the Bachelor Bourbon and Dovetail and Armida and Seagrass. So the MSRP for us is $84.99. We sometimes see as low as $79.99, and in sort of more boutique stores, we usually see $89 or $92.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly was thinking it was going to be.
I thought it was going to be
more
higher.
expensive. I know some people would be like, "Oh, he's just saying that because he's talking to Will," but
you're just saying that because you're talking to Will.
No, we've seen in the bourbon industry what we call a finishing tax. Like anytime you're finishing, and this is finished 3 different types of oak here.
Because you have to invest in the separate barrels and the time that it takes and the effort that it takes.
Right.
There is generally a dollar amount increase for that.
Yeah, I would have thought this would have been, north of 100 easy.
But then that makes sense because we didn't see that with Seagrass. So
That's true.
And I think also we are really dedicated to this being a whiskey that is not an everyday whiskey like this is my everyday drinker whiskey, but is sort of accepted as a standard in cool bourbons in America.
Mm-hmm.
And
how's it taste with Coke?
Chad.
It's a good.
But try it. My answer would be, am I allowed to swear on this?
Yeah.
You may.
It's fucking awesome with Coke, just like other good.
Sweet.
I mean,
it doesn't bourbon good to be good with Coke, but it's certainly nice if it's good with Coke.
Yeah. I mean, I've debated before I've made a cocktail with seagrass at home, and I thought, oh, people on the internet would yell at me if they saw me doing this. But it was just like a really good, simple old-fashioned with seagrass, and it was delicious.
Yeah.
And then we've been to a bar in New York that actually has a cocktail. It's like $35 made with seagrass, and it was so good.
Death and Co.
Death and Co. It's called the Flying Dutchman, I think. You should definitely try it. It's very good.
Yeah. It was expensive, but worth it.
They do cocktails with our whiskey as well as anyone in the country, and their team is so friendly and easy to work with.
They're so good.
It's very much a bucket list item of Sarah's to go to that.
Seagrass is probably our most cocktailable whiskey.
Oh, wow.
And it's not cheap, but it works really. Because part of it is seagrass is not an oaky whiskey, which lets it match with citrus a lot better than most whiskey does. But what I was saying is when we were developing this, sort of going back to what we talked about at the beginning, we really wanted this to be something we could make a lot of, and something that, though it is expensive, I'm not going to pretend that $80 or $90 is not an expensive bottle of whiskey. It is, but is reasonable in a way that if someone were to say, what's your favorite bourbon? What we aspire is a year or 2 years from now, some people are going to say Vantage. And you can't do that if no one can find it, and you can't do that if it's $300 a bottle.
Wow.
When you ask
that's a really good mentality.
Can we just pause for a second? Like, that makes complete sense. There's nothing about that statement that you just made, Will, that was like, well, that's extraordinary. But it sort of is.
But it also seems kind of like
it's a very much a duh statement, but also I never would have thought of it like that statement.
Yeah.
Like, of course it needs to be available, and of course it needs to not be $300 or even $150 because
unaffordable.
That's not going to become the masses' favorite, because that's going to be out of the reach of most of your consumers, right? Or the majority of them, at least.
Yeah.
Right. And we know it's not going to be the masses' favorite, but like, that to us would be the coolest thing ever. If a lot of bourbon, like real bourbon people, are like,
enthusiasts,
my favorite Vantage. It's not the only thing I drink. It's not something I drink every day, but you ask me my favorite, that's the answer. Because when you ask someone their favorite bourbon and they say like Thomas Handy, you're like, okay, cool, but like, I don't even want to talk to you anymore.
Right, because when will I ever taste that? It's very difficult.
William LaRue Weller.
If someone asks me like, what's my favorite thing of all time, that's very different than saying like, what do you like? Like, what's your favorite right now? What are you drinking? You know?
Yeah, because also you treat it more as, when I can get it, I love WLW or something. But
who doesn't?
You're not often getting it. So when it's, we bang the drum a lot of like Rare Breed and some of these other ones that are very impactful, but are fairly readily available. I know there's
very
been
accessible.
A glass shortage, kind of hurt them recently, but ones like that where for what you're getting, and we've always called it a value, and people have been like, it's not a value, it's $45.
Because it's not cheap.
It's like, cheap isn't value. That's not, you're not, so we kind of, that's been a topic that we've reached a few times, but no, it makes total sense.
What I really like about this is it feels very flexible. Like every time I taste it, I feel like it's so layered. I'm thinking about it in a different way. Like, I'm thinking about it as an after dinner drink. I'm thinking about it with a food pairing.
Yeah,
I'm thinking about it like for people who like cigars. It feels like it would be, go very well in that. If you wanted to make a cocktail, I feel like something very, again, simple. You would want to keep the highlight on this product, but you could do that. I think it would lend itself to that. It's just all around.
I have come to like it on the rocks with an orange twist. I think it has enough body that it's like it makes a great old-fashioned, but you don't even need to bother with the bitters and the sugar.
Simple syrup.
Because it just has enough body to handle itself. Does well on the rocks, but the orange twist I think brings out a lot in it actually. And
that's how I like the seagrass, but with a lemon twist.
Right.
Yeah. On a hot day, like that's perfect.
Our company, when there's people in our company hanging out and we're trying to support an account that has seagrass, if they're really busy and we don't want to bother them to make, something fancy with it, we drink seagrass and tonic. Because like seagrass just in for gin really well. And so, in fact, my favorite seagrass drink is Boulevardier, but the first time I had it was when I was having a conversation with one of the people that works on our sales team about how I like it subbed in for gin, and I ordered a seagrass Negroni, and they were like, "That's just a Boulevardier." And I was Oh, like didn't even think of it that way, but that's what it is. Seagrass and Campari, like chef's kiss.
Wow. Okay, I'm gonna have to try that. It's so weird how like we have so
Huh.
many cocktail recipes and people have books and books about cocktails, but like when you boil it down, there's only a handful of like executions of. They all go back to the same base
Yeah,
mentality
totally.
or like idea, like
And
Yeah.
that's how really good training in bars works. Also, really good training in kitchens. It's like you actually learn the base build of if it's French cooking, it's the mother sauces. If it's Italian cooking, it's like
exactly.
ingredients based on liquid. Like there's just like how do you build things to then maximize the ingredients you have?
Mm-hmm. Right. Then you're
Um,
just playing with flavors and what ingredients you have access to and changing this for that. And it's all this, but it boils down to the same base.
yeah, and so like looking at cocktails as like okay 1-1-1 builds, which is like a Negroni build, or and though you don't have to do a 1-1-1 like starting that way, we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at a classic daiquiri build, and then being like okay this is a sour. It's really the same thing as a margarita. It's like the same like, uh, and then swapping Mr. Potato Heading any of those drinks with things
Right.
that are similar sweetness, similar acid levels. That's how you make cocktails.
Mm-hmm.
It's only when you sort of master that that you can be like, okay, well, I'm going to use this high proof rum, and so I either need like something with more water content, or I need to match it at a higher level, so I need more sugar and more acid, and like then you end up with totally different ratios. But it
Mm-hmm.
usually starts by taking a normal ratio and messing with one thing, and then adjusting the other stuff up to it.
Yeah.
Huh.
That's
All
why I
right,
love it. No, I
bring me-
love it. I could listen to that all day. It's very
Mhm.
like mad sciencey, but it's alcohol, so
Yeah,
it's fun.
I could see the
wheels turning?
The wheels turning when he said he's sub it out for gin.
I know my eyes are like,
Like,
whoa.
huh, interesting.
Any other Vantage facts to share?
I think what is exciting to us about Vantage and the sort of impetus behind it, besides, and frankly, I don't think I've ever been able to articulate it the way that I did to you just now. And like, I hope it's okay that I'm going to keep that one.
Yeah.
Please do.
Mm-hmm.
But also, we started developing Vantage not only looking at what was going on with the whiskey world, but also looking at what had gone on with us internally and what we realized we were able to do and what we felt like was being asked for but not being done in bourbon, which was don't give us something that's so different from other bourbons, but give us something that is tangibly more, that isn't just the same thing in a different bottle, and isn't just uh, a new fancy spin on something that has existed before, but was here's the canon of bourbon. It's 100% virgin oak. It's corn forward. It is hot enough that it feels like it's punching you in the face a little bit, but it is also sweet enough that it is easy to drink. It can mix with Coke. It tastes good on the rocks. The things that made bourbon popular, the reason that bourbon is growing in popularity against things like Scotch right now. We wanted to stay in that box, but we wanted to give people more. And so Vantage was named like after the phrase vantage point, or like our perspective on like how do we give people more given what we are able to do now because of the success, but also just like lessons that our company has learned over 6 or 7 years. And I'm just really excited to first of all be able to just talk about it openly now. I don't have to like be coy about what we're experimenting with anymore, but to hear feedback on it and to have these conversations with it, because I haven't had a release like this in America ever, even though I've been with the company for so long, because Seagrass blew up in the middle of a pandemic. I wasn't able to really talk to people and travel and talk to bars and see what they were doing and sit next to people and chat about Seagrass. It was very much interviews like this and then a lot of digital work. And just like begging people to try it because it was awesome. And then they would try it and then they bought it and it was great. But with Vantage, it makes me feel like going back to when I was talking about Barrell as a company to people who hadn't tried it before, and being like liquid to lip sync it, which I know is a little bit of a cliche in the whiskey world, but is so true still. So I guess my message, and I know it sounds a little salesy and I hate doing that, but like we're going to do our best to convince as many bars as possible to take a chance on Vantage, because we want as many people to try it as possible, because we really believe in it as a serious whiskey in the scope of whiskey in America.
Yeah, well, I think with your all's track record, just alone with the batches, but also, since Seagrass, like
And the dovetail, yeah.
in the dovetail, it's almost like, what risk? It's
No.
it's minimal risk.
But I also think, like, this would be good any time of year, but I feel like the timing of this release with the flavors that are in this bottle is almost perfect because it does feel very, like, cozy and warm, and it makes me, I don't know, I feel like if you were gonna if I was gonna tell somebody a bottle to grab, like if you're going for, a big holiday meal to share something with a lot of people, I feel like this would be something that's really nice. And like I said before, it could be a good after dinner drink. It could go well with a food pairing. You could make a fun cocktail with it or have a cigar with it, and I feel like it would just be a good communal bottle to take to something like that. So I don't think you could have released it at a better time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite the summer feel of like the Seagrass, but I can definitely drink this during the summer, and I feel like it's even going to be more at home when it starts to go fall and winter as well.
We say that as two people living in a state that
Kentucky.
Experience all 4 seasons,
Disclaimer.
People in California
Kentucky.
are like, what?
Seasons?
When it gets cold.
What are those? Yeah, but excellent job on this one. Sarah, a question for you.
Okay.
Between Batch 33 and Vantage,
don't make me choose.
Which one are you feeling more?
Don't make me choose.
Okay.
I mean, okay, if you're gonna make me choose, I really like the oak influence on this one. Okay. Like, I really like it a lot. I feel very inspired by this bottle.
Well, I was thinking about it myself. Obviously, I asked the question. And to me, they're a little different categories because one, you got, Then
why'd you make me choose?
Bourbon over here in Batch 33, and then this is, a finished whiskey. So if I were drinking this blind and thinking it was just a bourbon, I'd be like, what's some really crazy things happening here? But, drinking it with the mindset that this is a finished whiskey or a finished, blend of straight bourbons, but, I mean, it is still finished. It's in that different category. So I don't have an answer for my own question.
That was rude.
How about you,
Will?
Will?
That was very rude. He's not going to choose.
We can ask him.
I would rather ask him about what's coming next.
All right, fine.
In terms of what's coming next, no, it's always so much coming from us. So it's more like what's coming out really soon and or is exciting and for one reason or another. The Gray Label Bourbon is coming out again this year. That'll be out probably at the beginning of October. Same thing with Gold Label Bourbon. Gray Label Dovetail came out already this year, and we are working on Gold Label Dovetail as well. I can say that even though it hasn't been released yet because the cola leaked. And then the Gray Label and the Gold Label Seagrass are continually. So we've released our blend this year of Gray Label Seagrass. We're going to release our blend of Gold Label Seagrass a little later in the year. Same thing with the New Year Bourbon. There will be a New Year Bourbon this year.
Yay.
So it's strange for me.
Sorry. Can you just real quickly explain to the people the difference between the gray and the gold?
So with our portfolio, we have what we call the Evergreen series or the Core series, Dovetail, Armida, Seagrass, and then the batches of bourbon are sort of in the or the Core line as well. We make a $250 bottle of each of those that's limited that we call the Gray Label. So the entire Gray Label series is the same price, but it is a sort of elevated version of the Core. And then in just the bourbon and Seagrass, we make an even older blend, longer in the secondary maturation, using rarer, more complicated whiskeys. That is the Gold Label series, which is about $500 a bottle, and there's very little of it. It's usually 1,000, 2,000, maybe 3,000 bottles for the whole world of each year. And this, the first time we did just bourbon, and then we did Seagrass at the beginning of the year. This year we did Seagrass again. We'll release Seagrass again. So there'll be bourbon, Seagrass, and Dovetail in the Gold Label series this year.
Okay.
Neat.
Yeah.
And then obviously this is your latest release, and you said there will be a new year.
There'll be a new year. So yeah, when people ask what's coming, there's always things coming from us. So it's like, how do I answer that without saying too many things? But I would actually say that the thing that I most implore people to try for the rest of the year is Vantage. That it is not the most expensive of the things that we're releasing. It's not the rarest of the things that we're releasing, but it's actually the largest project that we're releasing this year. It's the most impactful to the whiskey community at large, I think.
But I think that's good if you recommend that. That means the most people can also try it, have access to it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. Lovely.
Cool.
Lovely, lovely. Well, thanks so much, Will, for spending. It's been an hour, right?
Yeah. It has been over an hour.
It's been an hour. Well, not quite. But
not quite.
We're almost
Goes
there.
back to having fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I guess just, remind people of how they can keep up with all things Barrell Craft Spirits, including Stellum and everything else.
So the best way to totally keep up is to send an email to contact@barrelbourbon.com and ask to be put on the email list, or go to our website, barrelbourbon.com, and sign up for the newsletter. Because the most information about our releases and the way to get them upon release is done via our email list. But of course, you can always find us Barrell Bourbon on Instagram or Twitter and Facebook and you name it. But more and more, as the social media space gets noisier and noisier in general, more people investing and doing it really well. I actually think that you pick the brands you really like and you get on their email list, because good brands reward people on email lists in a way that you don't realize until you kind of realize you get information faster than everyone else. Our emails go out at the same time as press releases. The people on our email list find out at the same time as newspapers.
Okay.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Nice. That makes us feel less special.
No,
kidding. Well, very cool. Glad to have tasted these new products, and yeah, I would definitely echo your sentiments that people should try Vantage, because it is pretty yummy. I do enjoy.
I will be drinking a lot more of this bottle.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, again, we want to thank our guest Will for hopping on and chatting with us again, bringing us all the good news, all things Barrell Craft Spirits, and I'm sure we will do this again at some point.
I hope so.
Thanks again.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, folks. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that conversation, and I know that we did.
Definitely did.
We are still not back in Kentucky yet. We're still traveling, but next Sunday...
I think we're still traveling.
But
we'll be back the Sunday after that.
Right.
So hopefully this holds you over, and the Friday's Produce episode holds you over until then.
So eventually we will be back in front of you actually live.
And when we get back, we'll let you know all the things that we've been doing on our travels.
Yeah, we'll have a big slideshow of all of our vacations.
You have to look at all the pictures. And then if you sit through an hour long, there's a timeshare deal or whatever.
That's right.
You get a free lunch with
exciting investment
opportunities. A mediocre steak.
Very mediocre. All right, thanks so much, guys. We appreciate you. And until next time, drink more bourbon.
Bye.